President Donald Trump has reiterated his proposal to relocate Palestinians from Gaza to Egypt and Jordan, aiming to quote-unquote clean out the Gaza Strip as well as the West Bank. Such ethnic cleansing would not be possible without the complicity of the Egyptian and Jordanian government. So let's take a look at Egypt. The road from the days of Nasser with his unifying Arab nationalism message, terrifying the United States, to the current regime, complicit in the genocide of Palestinians, concerned more about suppressing its own people than the fate of Middle East or outside intervention. It all started when Gamal Abdel Nasser passed away and left the reins of governance to Anwar Sadat. For all that he accomplished, the lack of democracy under Nasser will always be a stain on his legacy and played a role in the ever-extending reach of the military. Through the Camp David Accords, a series of agreements brokered by the US President Jimmy Carter in 1978 between Egypt and Israel, which also included Jordan for some parts, the US ensured Egyptian complicity, and the Egyptian army no longer needed popular backing to rule the country, as it now had found a new ally, the US. This led to silence on issues around the Middle East, as well as increased human rights abuses against its own population. Camp David Accords were arrangements primarily by Egyptian, Jordanian, and Israeli governments. Palestinians were negated from any real agency in the accords. Their quote-unquote rights was supposedly ensured under a vaguely defined quote-unquote self-governing authority, the modality of which had to be determined by the three nations. They agreed to a quote-unquote transitional arrangement for the West Bank and Gaza for a period not exceeding 5 years. This 5 year was meant to start as soon as the so-called self-governing authority was formed for Gaza and the West Bank. Final peace negotiations were to take place within this 5-year period, while quote-unquote the solution from the negotiations must also recognize the legitimate right of the Palestinian peoples and their just requirement. It is sufficient to say Israel has not held up its part of the deal, but more surprisingly, Jordan and Egypt have not attempted to even diplomatically hold Israel accountable, and they both signed peace treaties with Israel without the Palestinian question answered. It might have something to do, at least in Egypt's case, as we'll discuss Jordan in another video, on the military aid it has received from the US. It is important to reiterate that while Nasser was an immensely popular anti-imperialist and pro-pan-Arabist leader, he did gain power through the military, and the military has ruled Egypt since. Sadat, his successor, took advantage of the deal, consolidating military rule in the country by making it dependent on American support. The United States has provided the Egyptian military with over $55 billion in military aid since 1979, the year the peace treaty was signed with Israel. American taxpayers provided Egypt with $3.56 million a day, or $1.3 billion a year. On paper, neither the Camp David Accords nor the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty obligates the United States to provide military assistance to Egypt. However, when the peace treaty was signed, US officials informally established a 3-to-2 ratio for military aid, with Egypt receiving 2/3 of the amount given to Israel. However, this arrangement was not formalized, and the US never guaranteed that this ratio would continue indefinitely, thus ensuring Egyptian complicity. While Jordanian complicity is based on a variety of issues mostly rooted in the Hashemite struggle to cling on to power, which I will cover in another video, it is worth mentioning here that since 1978 the US has provided over $20 billion in military assistance to Jordan. After 9/11, military aid increased, reaching over $1 billion, and in recent years Jordan receives about $1.5 billion annually in US military assistance. So since the David Accords and the peace treaty with Israel and subsequent abandonment of the Palestinians to occupation, Egypt has moved further to the right and authoritarianism. Sadat's shift towards a more open market economy and embracement of neoliberalism led to corruption and wealth inequality. While very few benefited, most Egyptians suffered to rising prices and a decline in state subsidies, economic policies that plague Egypt to this day. In 1981, for example, Sadat launched a mass arrest campaign against intellectuals, Islamists, leftists, journalists, and activists who opposed his policies. This included members of the Muslim Brotherhood, communists, Nasserists, and even some Coptic Christian leaders. These arrests fueled further resentment. The emergency laws he enacted during this period remained in place until the Arab Spring. It allowed indefinite detention without trial and suppression of political opposition. He also helped Mubarak, his successor, maintain his authoritarian rule. Since the Arab Spring and the ousting of Mubarak, Egypt has seen a return to military-backed authoritarian rule under Sisi, who has far surpassed his predecessors in terms of brutality and repression. While Morsi's government faced criticism for its authoritarian tendencies, the level of state violence and human rights abuses under Sisi has been far greater, making his rule one of the most oppressive periods in modern Egyptian history. In one instance alone, Sisi's security forces massacred over 1,000 pro-Morsi demonstrators in Cairo's Rabah Square. So, it becomes clear what the source of, at first, silence and later complicity in the genocide of the Palestinians is. The government of Egypt's trajectory from Nasser's pan-Arab nationalism to today's military-backed authoritarianism reveals a regime that has steadily moved away from regional leadership towards complicity with imperial interests, ran by a ruling class bowing to external powers and neoliberalism for their own privilege, more afraid of young people seeking freedom in Tahrir Square than a genocidal regime next door.